Buonasera, buonasera.
Good evening. Good evening, all of you, also people following online this edition of the Festival of Economics that we decided we would dedicate to the memory of Alberto Alesina. Robert Schiller, thank you for being here with us this evening. We are very happy to have you here. We actually tried to have you at previous editions of the festival, and now we managed, so we are so happy to have you here. Mr. Schiller is one of the economists who throughout their career were never afraid of saying things as they are or were, also going against others. And this meant going against mainstream economics in terms of the behavior, for instance, of financial markets, being not consistent with the theory of efficient markets and the postulates of the theory of expectations and rational expectations. So these analyses and studies were so important that he received the Nobel Prize on Economics in 2013, together with two other scholars. Lars Peter Hansen will be with us tomorrow at the festival, by the way. And so they received this Nobel due to their contribution in terms of pricings and national market prices and financial markets. So Mr. Schiller was also one of the very few economists who managed to foresee and forecast the crisis, the financial crisis, and he actually launched within the context of his publishing activity a number of signals. He warned against that in his book from 2000, Exuberance, Rational Exuberance. He wrote about that. And also in 2005, he wrote about that. There is a famous paper of his from 2003 in which he specifically focused on speculative bubbles in the real estate sector. So again in 2005 in a book, and then in an article in September 2007 on the eve, we might say, of the beginning of the financial crisis, 1 year before the crisis, he wrote that there would be a collapse of the real estate market in the United States with the following wave of panic. So he really was able of foreseeing things, and he received many accolades and awards due to that. So one of the very characteristics of Robert Schiller's work is the following. You see, in the beginning, he worked a lot with quantitative data and econometric studies at the beginning of the career, and then he moved on to the border between economics and psychology, and together with Richard Thaler, he is considered the founder of behavioral finance, which analyzes the psychology of investors. And in this respect, one of the things that he studied most was how ideas contaminate and infect behaviors in a way, so that these can account for certain trends in financial markets. And possibly he was one of the first economists who studied the SIRR models, susceptible, infected, and removed SIR models, which is what we're using now in order to study the epidemic, the COVID epidemic. Of course, you used it to investigate the contagion of and infection of ideas, but this is the model that we are using now to understand in economic terms what is happening to or with COVID. So to tonight he will address us on the contagion of bad ideas that go viral. I believe that one of the bad ideas that he will probably focus on, which is for me very important because it is something that shows up and comes up regularly, is the fact that you can reduce taxes and do so in a self-financing way, which is the Laffer curve. So I must say that also recently in Italy, in the political debate, this idea came forward again. It is the dream of many people in government to be able to curb taxes and finance that at the same time. So possibly you will talk about that as well. So without further ado, thank you again, Robert Schiller, for being with us, and you have the floor. The contribution lasts approximately 30 minutes, and then we will have some minutes for questions or comments. So people following us online should send to us their questions and comments, and we will voice them. So thank you again. You have the floor.
It's yours.
Thank you. So thank you for that nice introduction. I wrote my PhD dissertation on rational expectations. And I think there is something to that for limited application. You also brought up COVID-19. I have to say that it was a strange coincidence for me that my book on narrative economics came out right before the COVID-19 epidemic had any publicity at all, before it started. Suddenly the world is engulfed with talk about epidemics. So let me move to my slides. I think I'm going to be talking about popular narratives as if they were diseases that spread by word of mouth. We say going viral. That's an analogy to a disease epidemic already, so it's in our thinking. I think it won't be too much longer that it finds a place in much more economic discussion than in the past. But the thing I have to emphasize at the beginning is that human speech, which is a human universal, it evolved in Darwinian evolution, and it is the key thing about how our society functions, because through speech we coordinate our activities. And settle on our objectives. But you have to distinguish between speech conveying matter-of-fact information and speech which is storytelling. So a narrative is a telling. The definition of the word narrative is a telling of a story that imbues it with meaning, emotional significance, approval or disapproval, or moral lessons. It tends to focus on new things or things that are unusual that make a good story. And so we end up forming our economic judgments while remembering stories. Human interest, typically. There has to be some human interest. And then we tend to remember stories that have gone viral. So my approach to understanding economic history is to look at what were people saying then. And I'm talking about ordinary people, not professional economists. Now, sometimes they will pick up on that, but not always. Mostly not. So here is my book. It came out in English in October, and it is just now coming out in Italian, and then in German and other languages as well. But the thing that we put on the cover back last year was a diagram showing a epidemic curve. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's really also, I could have said epidemic economics as the title of the book. But it is going to be not a disease epidemic usually, but a story epidemic that spreads by people retelling the story. Now, narrative is something that is increasingly watched or talked about in all of the social sciences. This shows a count. The black bar lines show a count of the number of the percentage of scholarly articles that contain the word narrative. All right. And you can see that, well, the field with the least attention to narratives is finance. Kind of hard to believe, since I think narratives matter so much in finance. Economics is the second worst. But there's an array of hope here. The gray bars are just for the last 10 years. And you can see that in all social sciences, including economics and finance, there is increasing talk about narratives. Why is this? I think it's partly because people are discovering the importance of narratives, more and more people are, but also because we now have digitized text that we can search. Like, for example, here I'm using JSTOR, which is a digitized version of scholarly journals in all of these, including hard sciences as well. What I want to try to understand in this book is, you could say bad ideas, but ideas that create an unnecessary fluctuation in our activity. I mean, the sociologists and the political scientists will talk about other things regarding narratives. But what I'm interested in is understanding why the economy breaks down from time to time. So here I have shown the real gross domestic product per capita in the United States. That's the blue line. The red line is consumption expenditures, personal expenditures on consumption. And these are corrected for inflation and population growth. Well, what you see is a wiggly straight line, and this is on a log scale on the vertical axis. So the changes are like in percentage terms. So you can see that they're both growing very steadily over better part of a century. But there are these wiggles. We call those wiggles recessions or depressions. This thing starts out with the Great Depression in the 1930s. That's the biggest drop of all. And then this is 2020. This is this year. It looks kind of outstanding, doesn't it? It's a dramatic event, topped only by the Great Depression. In fact, it isn't even topped by the Great Depression in the suddenness and intensity of the drop that we've seen. So we want to predict where this is going. And I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to give you insights in how we can better do predictions like that. But a lot of social scientists looking at the curve after World War II, this is World War II. After World War II, they see a jagged shape, which some people think they see a cycle looking like a sine wave. But it's not really a sine wave. There are fluctuations in it, but they're not all the same length and the same size. So it's better to say that these might be a sequence of epidemic, all these ups and downs. And maybe we should understand the epidemics of narratives that go into them. So what is an epidemic curve? I showed you one on the cover of my book, but I have here the daily infections of COVID-19. And so in Italy, and you can see that it all started it started in China, but it started in Italy around March. And it formed a hump-shaped pattern. That's the epidemic curve. And it's gone, pretty much gone. It's not gone, but it's low level since. This vertical dash line is today, well, as of yesterday. Now, don't get alarmed by this red line. That's a worst-case scenario. If people drop all mitigation efforts, you're not going to do that. But it is predicting a second wave. This is what epidemics do. They tend to be hump-shaped curves, and then they tend to recur after a while. Maybe when there's a mutation or something in the environment changes, like the coming winter. But that's the model that I want. I want to think of the business cycle as not a cycle, but as a sequence of epidemics. So what's an example of a narrative epidemic? Well, here's an example. It's already mentioned. Art Laffer presented his theory called the Laffer curve at an occasion like this in front of two famous men. This is Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense in the United States. And this is Dick Cheney, who was Vice President of the United States. So this was big-time people in the United States. And Art Laffer is a professor of economics. There was a fourth member. This is a reenactment, which you can watch if you want on the web. The fourth member, Jude Wanniski, died before this reenactment, so he would be sitting here. But it's a story about a dinner. Oh, and by the way, he drew the diagram for his theory on a napkin like that. You can see it before him. For some reason, the story always mentions the napkin. So this is what Jude Wanniski wrote up about in his book, The Way the World Works, in 1978. Nobody remembered that dinner. It was of no significance to most people. This is the diagram that Art Laffer drew on the napkin. And the diagram shows how much tax revenue you would get from various tax rates. If you tax income at a rate of 0, you'll get 0 revenue. That's uncontroversial. If you tax it at 100%, you also get 0 revenue because nobody will work if you're going to take all the money from them. So the curve of revenue as a function of tax rates has to be something like this. And then the punchline, this is a little bit like a joke. The punchline is if you have a certain amount of revenue, if you're trying to raise 1,000 euros or dollars or whatever, or 1,000 million, you can always choose either one of two tax rates. A is the high tax rate. There's always two of them, except at this point here. And so he was accusing governments of mistakenly choosing A when they could have chosen B. Now that's where it ends. It's like a punchline and a joke. But it went well because somehow the way Jude Wanniski wrote it up, who was a skilled writer, it became a contagious story. So here I'm doing a count on Google Ngrams of the searches for the term Laffer curve. And you can see that it's a hump-shaped curve, but not as dramatic. Well, it went up very fast, and it was slow to die out, and it hasn't died out, as Mr. Boeri says. So this is the Rubik's Cube. I mentioned it just as an example. Do I have it reversed? I'm sorry, I had it reversed. The blue line is... now I got myself confused.
Line is Laffer, and the red line is
a reverse.
Yes.
I think it's right. Okay, yes. I'm sorry. Rubik's Cube has taken a second wave. I think I may have mislabeled my axes. I'm sorry about that. I'll have to go check this. But the point is they're both epidemics. And Rubik's Cube is set up as an epidemic of a narrative also. There are narratives and stories about Rubik's Cube. Rubik wrote a book about it. The title of his book is Cubes. And so everyone relishes the thought of going viral. And it was storytellers who made Rubik's Cube viral. I like to think that these are new ideas, but the idea of the importance of narratives and stories is ancient. I'm quoting from Cicero, the Roman senator, who wrote a book called De Oratora in Latin, and this is a translation. First thing he emphasizes is that stories are central to the human kind. Men are facetious mimics or storytellers. Moreover, their stories should have some drama to them. Well, he wrote about the Prelucio before the gladiator combats in Rome. The Prelucio would have actors come out and brandish spears, and then they would actually fight, but it was fake. The people why would they be interested in fake fights when they're about to see the real thing? It's because the fake fighters were better at simulate. They were skilled actors and they knew how to create a story. I think just watching a fight to the death might not be that exciting. Think of it. It's hard to think of that. And this is also, he's quoting Simonides, who's another forgotten writer, that things are most strongly fixed in our mind which are communicated and imprinted upon them by the senses, and that these things are most easily retained in our minds when we have received from the hearing of or the understanding, if they are also recommended to the imagination by means of the mental eye. He's stressing to a speaker the importance of visual images, even imaginary visual. You have to tell a story with a picture to it. So that's an example of Laffer. It was the napkin. That diagram on a napkin is somehow a visual image that's attached to that story and makes it contagious. Just as a mutation of a disease makes it suddenly contagious. Oh, also, as Cicero said, that when a speaker speaks to a large audience, he is naturally excited in it to a more magnificent species of eloquence. So it's something about how we prod each other into thinking that some narrative is especially important. When you hear it again and again, you think that lots of people are into this, and it suddenly becomes memorable. It may also, the contagion rate of stories may depend in other ways on others' perceptions. So John Maynard Keynes in 1936 gave the famous beauty contest theory of the stock market, that people are like a beauty contest, in a beauty contest, that were then offered commonly in newspapers. The newspaper would picture 100 faces, photographs, and you were asked to pick the 6 prettiest faces and send that into the newspaper. You would win if you got closest to the most commonly mentioned 6. So you're trying to guess what other people are guessing. That tends to play a role in promulgation of narratives. So I look at what people saw. The October 19th, 1987 was the biggest one-day drop in world stock markets in history. Even it hasn't been caught up to since. There was a 22% drop in the U.S. stock market in one day, one business day. And so the newspapers before that, though, were writing about risks that the market would turn into a tailspin, or that portfolio insurance would push slides into scary falls. But people read those in the newspaper, but they also knew that everybody else was reading those in the newspaper. That was a narrative that you knew was popular, and so it colored your thinking about what the stock market might do. This is a picture that appeared in the Wall Street Journal in the morning before the markets opened, October 19th, 1987, the biggest one-day drop in history. And what they were doing? They're comparing the stock market in the 1980s up to that date. This is, and then they compare that with the stock market in the 1920s up to the 1929 crash. And so there's a forecast implicit here for today. Here's a visual image that is presented to people on the morning of the 1987 crash, suggesting that everybody's thinking that 1929 might happen again today. And it did happen again today because everyone expected it to happen. Also, we have to remember that it's not just one narrative, but it's a constellation of narratives. They feed on each other. So when William Jennings Bryan wrote about bimetallism in the 1890s, it swept across the world. And when Donald J. Trump, you might have heard of him, he's our president of the United States, he has tweets and big rallies, and he gets so much talk. People are marveling, how did he become such a center of attention? Well, I'll tell you, he's a good storyteller. And he's got a mind to keep reminding you of himself by saying outrageous things. He does it again and again. So he is I suggest you read one of his books. He explains this about how you've got to keep yourself in the public eye if you want to be a big success. Read his books. I hate to say I'm recommending anything from this man, but you know why he's there in the position he is. So these various stories, short stories like the Laffer curve, are just part of a whole constellation of epidemics. And they can be affected by the silliest of components, things that you wouldn't think have in them, but they're visual or other kinds of images that can change the contagion rate. There's something to hold on to you. And an epidemic goes when the contagion rate, C, goes above the recovery rate, or C times the number of susceptibles. So I think I've already spoken about this. Okay. So let me go back to the stock market. This is a plot I took from my Nobel lecture of the stock market from 1871 to the present in the blue line. Like, for example, here is 1929, the stock market crash of 1929. You see how much it went down. The green and red lines are the present values of subsequent dividends with a constant discount rate. So you can see that the true value, according to efficient markets theory, if it were known perfectly, is very smooth and trendy. But the stock market was jumping up and down all around that. The same thing is happening in different countries around the world. This is USA, China, Europe, and I can't read it down here on my screen. There's a similarity across countries for two reasons. One of them is that we trade with each other. The other one is we all read about the same stories. This is a plot of home prices from 1890 to the present in the United States. The blue line is the real price of a standard home. And it's quite striking how little it correlates with building costs, population, or interest rates, which you might think would drive home prices. They have a life of their own. This is the biggest boom in home prices. It was quite recent. You can read my book about the narratives that I think drove that. It's inconstancy in our thinking. This is a Google search count, Google Ngrams, of the reference to the term fair wage, the blue line. And you can see that fair wage started increasing in the late 19th century, and it peaked in the Great Depression. That's like 1938 there, the peak. And then it went down. It had an interruption during World War I guess. But it went right back up. So there were ideas brewing about fairness. And then now they're on the down part of the epidemic curve. People didn't talk about market wages, which is the wage in the market, which is determined. They tended to think of it as fairness that drives market changes. It was also a labor movement. This is just counts from Google searches for the term labor union. Forget that this is some sort of anomaly, but we see an epidemic curve for labor unions as well, and it's dying out. It may come back. We might get a second wave. So let me just talk a little bit about epidemic theory and mathematical epidemics. Here again is just another example of an epidemic curve of about 5 years ago, the Ebola epidemic in Africa, which was successfully contained. Outside of Africa, we didn't have many cases. But you can see that it was rising in this particular place, in Ebola, in Lofa County. It was rising for about a dozen weeks. Over this period, the contagion rate was higher than the recovery rate. And then it peaked. The contagion rate started falling. Why did it start falling? And fell below the recovery rate. So people are getting better in greater numbers than are getting sick. And then it just disappeared for a while. It's hanging by probably by a sliver and threatens to come back again. But that's the model that was mathematized in the field of mathematical epidemics by Kermack and McKendrick. It's called the SIR model of disease epidemics. These are medical school things. But there are three, as Mr. Boeri said, there are three components, S, I, and R. R are susceptibles, people who haven't caught it yet and are not immune. I is the percent, they're both in percent, the percent of the population which is infected and spreading the disease. And then R is the percent of the population recovered. The key equation is the middle one here. And it says there is a C parameter times the number of susceptibles, percent of susceptibles is the contagion rate, whereas the recovery rate is constant, R. And so DIDT is high, is positive when contagion is stronger than recovery. But the model has in itself the end of the epidemic. So this is a solution for parameters C equals 0.28 and R equals 0.14. Roughly the parameters I would guess to apply to COVID-19 if there were no mitigation efforts, no one wearing face masks, etc. So what you can see is that the epidemic curve is the orange line here. It's the number of new cases per day. The black line is the total number of infectives, of course, greater than the number of... so either one of these could be called the epidemic curve. The dashed line is the percentage of the population who have recovered. And in this case, if there's no mitigation effort, it ends up at about 80%. 80% of the population are immune. This is called herd immunity. There won't be any more. Because the contagion rate is below the recovery. There'll be a few, but no trend. And I won't get into this. Is the size of the epidemic is dependent on C over R, which is called the basic reproduction number. The speed of the C over R determines how many people ultimately catch it. But the level of C or R determines how fast the epidemic goes. You can have fast epidemics that last a matter of days or weeks, and you can have slow epidemics that last a century. You can have epidemics that hit 90% of the population, or epidemics that hit 10% of that population. You can do it either way by adjusting C over R. Unfortunately, C over R with no mitigation for COVID-19 appears to be dangerously high. And that's why we're doing all this work to flatten the curve, the epidemic curve. This is the size of the epidemic depends on the basic reproduction number. And it can be almost 100% of the population if C over R is high enough. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to flatten the curve. And these are predictions for COVID-19 in the United States. But the same thing would happen anywhere. You'll end up with fewer deaths if you can flatten the curve, lower the contagion rate, or raise the recovery rate. These are waves of epidemic, which I already talked about. And these are among possible scenarios for COVID-19, according to the Center for Infectious Diseases Research and Policy. So it can have repeated waves that just go on and on every wave period. If you saw this in a narrative epidemic, it would create maybe a business cycle. But it's not generally so precise. And they can be different size at different times. This is just some predictions showing individual countries. Epidemics occur at the same time in a narrative constellation. We just had an epidemic in the United States from it was really a story told by a video, or actually multiple passerby videos of police brutality in the George Floyd case. So I don't know if this picture strikes a bell in you. I thought it would only be in America, but it turns out that people all over the world heard about this episode. Why did they hear about it? Because the story was told so well by the camera people at the scene. And it's a horrifying story. Also, people will click on it and on the social media because they think they should be informed. It shows a black man dying at the under the knee of a white police officer. You normally wouldn't click on that, but maybe you will this time because you want to see what's happening. Other things have narrative epidemic. These are economic models, the ISLM model, the real business cycle model, the overlapping generations model, the multiplier accelerator model. These are all famous models, but they're all dying because they're still good, I think. I like these models, but they're no longer fresh. They're no longer contagious. Also, famous economists, I've got a number of them here, and they all go through epidemic curve. It seems to me so fundamental to our lives. It's kind of sad. Some people outlive the epidemics outlive their lives, like Henry George, whom you've probably never heard of, but he died in the late 19th century around here. His epidemic kept growing. Why? Not because he was doing anything. He was gone because they were contagious. They're not so contagious now because they're more 19th century, I guess. We don't tell his stories anymore. Most of us don't. So in my book, I list a lot of epidemics. Panic versus confidence, frugality versus conspicuous consumption, the gold standard versus bimetallism, labor-saving machines, automation, real estate booms and busts, stock market bubbles, boycotts, profiteers, and the wage price spiral. There's so many, and this isn't an exhaustive list. There's so many epidemics that it's hard for us to manage them. We have to find some way to get computers to tabulate epidemics and give us a sense of what is affecting the markets and what is driving changes. But let me just mention a couple of these. The idea of confidence as an important economic variable. It goes back to the 19th century when it was financial panics that caused, this is the blue line, the financial panics drove the epidemic. And these are particular, this is the panic of 1873. This is the panic of 1893. This is the panic of 1907. But somehow they managed to keep going, ratcheting higher through time. And since then, we've changed our language. Now we talk about business confidence. So this red line, this is business confidence. It soared during the Great Depression. People were saying businessmen have lost confidence. After the war came, they forgot about business confidence and it went way back down. But it's back up again, or it's sort of back up. And green is consumer confidence. They've all fallen off somewhat. But I think may come back. This is the Great Depression has become one of our favorite narratives. And you can see that it grew after the Great Depression. It wasn't particularly prominent during the Great Depression. Here's the Great Depression. But now we have this story. And then when the 2007 through 2009 financial crisis came, attention to the Great Depression soared, absolutely soared. And we named it after the Great Depression. It's been called the Great Recession. So we were clearly reliving another narrative. And people stopped spending, and the stock market collapsed because they thought it might be 1929 again. I have one more narrative and I'll stop. The technological unemployment narrative. It started in the early 1800s, but it started in a small way, that people began to fear machines replacing jobs. And so this was weaving machines in 1811 with the, I think there we have it. Then there were agricultural machines that were replacing farm labor. The concern about labor-saving machinery replacing jobs rose until around the Great Depression. Then they devised another new word for it, technological unemployment. And it was huge in the Great Depression. And then it's following an epidemic curve. It's falling off again. So we had to invent new words to keep it live. It's like a mutation in the epidemic. Another idea that relates to this loss of confidence is the idea that we have involuntary unemployment, that there's such a thing as involuntary unemployment. Back in the 19th century, if someone lost a job, people thought it was his or her fault. Maybe they're not very good at what they do. There was some talk about involuntary unemployment, but they can't use the word unemployment. It hadn't been invented yet. The word unemployment in English was invented in the 1890s or thereabouts. And they called it idleness, but idleness has a connotation of laziness. So what happened is in the Great Depression, right around here, this is the Great Depression, we learned to think of the unemployed people as victims. It wasn't their fault. And I think this changed a lot of our impressions. It made us worried about becoming unemployed, and it made us less likely to want to flaunt our wealth. And I think that has been a factor in recent fluctuations. Here is other terms for, they each have their own epidemic. Robot, automation, artificial intelligence, etc. But they've been coming in more and more. In the 1930s, they were talking about robots. You can't see it very well here, but there they were. The dial telephone was a robot, called that at the time, because it replaced the job of an operator. So even some very smart people thought that the Great Depression was caused by robots replacing jobs, essentially. This is Albert Einstein. Remember him? He said in 1933 in an interview that the Depression was caused by the improvement in the apparatus of production that has decreased the need for human labor and therefore eliminated part of labor from the economic circuit. So he thought he knew what caused the Great Depression. Hardly anyone talks about this as a cause of the Great Depression, but I think it was indirectly, because it made people fear that they were going to lose their job. And so they stopped working, or they stopped spending, which was horrible for the economy. Now we're stopping spending because of COVID-19, which is different. But it could launch again a narrative like this, because this narrative is in the wings. It's like an old disease that might suffer another wave. So I think we'll have this is my last slide, we'll have an interesting future for narrative economics, because partly because new technology, like social media, are changing our mode of contagion. There will be new data availability with digitized. It's growing, digitized text and speech, and new forms. I think economic theory will have to take into account these things. And we ought to start collecting better information. Even though we have tons of digitized text, we can do it better in the spirit of recording history. We still don't hear common conversations. I have to rely on newspapers and the like to guess what narratives were. Okay, I'll stop with that and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. Grazie mille per questa lezione meravigliosa.
So thank you so much for this splendid presentation. You gave us a lot of food for thought. And perhaps also during this crisis, some terms perhaps will become viral. For example, the term contagion, the fact that you can get infected. Now, I have two questions. Well, there are many questions, but two questions that have just arrived. The first, we have learned that self-regulation for the economy creates instability and chaos. So controls and regulation authorities have been set up. Today's media contribute to this lack of regulation. What do you think about the future? Do you think that there will be the need for greater regulation on all these issues? And then second question. As we have seen during the crisis of the bank system of the 21st century, or during the COVID-19 pandemics, events which one day were not considered, the other day can cause crisis and recession. Do you think that in the future it will be possible to avoid these black swans? So let's start from these two questions.
Okay. I wrote another book about regulation with George Akerlof called Fishing for Fools. And we're not in favor of too much regulation, but we think that the problem with a capitalist economy is that we need, there's a tendency to manipulate or mislead, and we have to have authorities imposing the truth. It's a messy problem. So more recently, since we wrote that book, we've seen the misuse of the social media to spread lies and to impersonate others to spread lies. And we have to have some kind of regulation. And that's a deep question of exactly what form it would make. But what does a social media site do when it sees that someone has made a video go viral that's based on a lie, a known lie? And that's a difficult question. We do have a problem that has been emphasized recently by anti-regulation groups, is that there's a tendency for regulations to pile up. They keep thinking of new ones. And they don't cancel the old ones that didn't work so well, so that life becomes very difficult to comply with all of the regulation. So that's something that we have to allow to happen. Now, the second question was about black swans. A black swan is something so rare that you think it could never happen, and then suddenly it does. So a good example of a black swan is a worldwide pandemic like COVID-19. We haven't seen one as bad as this since 1918. And so it's easy to imagine that it can't happen. Epidemiologists were warning that we should be prepared for a global pandemic, but they weren't heeded. Why? Because the story had lost its resonance. First of all, the story of the 1918 influenza epidemic is not so dramatic. It's in the form of the story. What is the story? Somebody got sick, they went to the hospital, and they died. Is that an exciting story? I don't think so. World War II is so much more exciting. They make movies about it. They don't make any movies about the influenza epidemic of 1918. It's just not story-worthy. So it gets forgotten until it happens again, and then suddenly it dominates. And that's what happened with COVID-19. You couldn't get anybody's attention to the possibility of an epidemic just a year ago, but now it's because of its connections to current events and to things we've seen. It's a contagious story that unfortunately there's all kinds of contagious stories occurring at the present time because it's a black swan event, and things that are probably unlikely. That, for example, the COVID-19 was started by some bad actor who did it on purpose and created a new virus. That same story, which, by the way, circulated during the influenza epidemic, many people blamed the 1918 influenza epidemic on the Germans at the end of World War I, who were desperate, and they thought that even if they couldn't protect their own citizens from influenza, they could at least shake things up, and who knows, it might help us win the war. That was a narrative epidemic, totally forgotten now. So black swans are a fact of life, that the world suddenly seems to change before our eyes in an important way that we never anticipated. So COVID-19 is a good example of that.
Good. Quindi qui c'era.
So there is also an issue related to information, whether we can do something in order to limit information so that there is excessive contagion of these ideas. And then another question, a question from myself. Well, you showed us epidemiological models like the SIR. Well, these are mechanical models, apparently very simple. But one of the reasons why probably they did not predict the contagion of COVID-19 lies not so much in the fact that mitigation measures were taken by various governments, but also because probably people reacted to the spread of COVID-19 by adopting responsible behaviors, for example, putting on masks or avoiding going to crowded places. So also people's reaction is important in order to stop certain situations. So I wonder, in the case of narrative, can we speak of something similar? Or do you think that in the area of narratives, there is a sort of a mechanical model? Because, you know, it's very difficult to counter these ideas when they get spread. So what do you think about that?
Quindi.
Yes, governments naturally limit information to try to encourage people to keep their confidence. Throughout every depression, there are efforts by public figures to restore confidence. And they're very careful not to say anything that might disturb confidence. That's unfortunately a problem. So our president, Donald Trump, was trying to keep confidence up when he said at the beginning of 2020 that he thought, don't worry about the COVID-19. I think it would just go away, and that the mainstream media are being too alarmist about it. He had good intentions, I suppose, when saying that. But the same thing happened in World War I, by the way, when the World War influenza epidemic was starting to really take hold. Governments didn't want that reported, and newspapers self-censored, I think. There wasn't much mention of the epidemic when it began in the spring of 1918. And unfortunately, that makes the epidemic worse. You have to scare people at the beginning of a disease epidemic so that they'll take responsible maneuvers. So the SIR model, you're right, is a model that assumes a constant C parameter. And so the changes in the contagion rate occur only because of changes in the percent susceptible in the population. And so that's a extreme case. There are so many models, variations of SIR models. You can put things into it that might represent, mitigate. You could put in a parameter for C that declines with time. So SIR model is it's almost 100 years old, so let's not expect too much of it. But the CDC has a link on its website. That's the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, in which they look at forecasting models for the COVID-19 epidemic and conclude that about half of them are SIR-based. Others are sort of reduced form model that's not less theoretical. But there's a lot of reliance on an SIR basis for modeling of epidemics. and it seems very intuitive that it should be part of a model. But yes, responsible behavior and narratives that affect responsible behaviors are unfortunately, or fortunately or not, are part of the epidemic. So in the United States, there became a narrative that that wearing of face masks is unmanly, or it's a political statement. So a lot of people who are Trump supporters will not wear face masks, and that's an unfortunate narrative. There's a co-epidemic of that narrative with the actual COVID-19 disease epidemic.
Thank you so much. Grazie mille.
So thank you. Unfortunately, well, we have many other questions. Just one, the last one. At a time when single people, individuals have a huge amount of sources of information, how can they rely on these sources? And what about what suggestions can you give so that individuals can navigate in the world of information? So what do you think about the massive presence of information, and how can one navigate in it?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, and we could spend a lot of time on that topic. There is a loss of trust in the present political environment, and it's seen around the world. There's a sense that people are more dishonest than we thought they were years ago, and I think that people have to think about. They have to understand what makes things go viral and disabuse themselves of certain notions. So one notion is that a newspaper that you've read for many years, you've never seen a lie in the newspaper, and so you trust it. That develops. There is a thing of reputation that can persist, but eventually the reputation may be lost, and then that brings chaos. There's a big sociological literature on trust and economics literature that an ambiance of trust, that there are some people or some media that you can trust, is very important, and it's something that's easily lost, and that's hard to control. I think famous publications of the past have lost some of this trust, but I think we have to think about. We have to avoid thinking that public opinion is not in itself a reliable designator of trustworthiness. That's that things will go through epidemic. We have to reflect that bad ideas will go viral and affect a lot of people, and realize that a lot of people are not reading carefully. There may be an important report that came out by scholars or government officials on the state of the economy, but very few people will read that. So they get their impressions from the virality of the narrative. We have to maybe this should be taught in schools so that people will learn to be respecting honest reputations, and not, but also to recognize that they can lose their trust, and we have to be individually responsible. We have to actually read studies from time to time if we're going to know how to vote.
Grazie mille. Quindi l'importanza
So thank you so much. So the importance of reputation and then the fact that economists should pay more attention to narrative. In the future, I hope that the word narrative will be more frequent in scholars' articles. Thank you so much, Mr. Schiller, for this splendid presentation. There are many other questions, but unfortunately we don't have any time left. Hopefully we will welcome you here in Trento in the future, physically, and also have a physical audience. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.